Montana Territory, January 1879, the snow came down in thick, silent sheets, covering the world in white as Yates Langford reined in his horse at the ridge just past Elk Creek. His breath misted in the bitter air. He had not meant to ride this far, not with dusk falling fast, but something had pulled him out past the familiar stretch of his land. Maybe it was the way the wind had changed. Maybe it was something else. He spotted her near the tree line, no movement at first, just a lump in the snow that did not belong. Then the wind shifted and he heard it. A cry, not hers, a baby's. Yates kicked his boots from his stirrups and was off his horse before it stopped moving. He stumbled the last few feet, heart thudding hard in his chest. The snow was deep. Whoever she was, she had fallen half into a drift, her dress soaked through, her shawl stiff with frost. She lay curled around a tiny bundle, arms wrapped tight around it. "Miss," his voice cracked. He dropped to his knees beside her. "Miss, can you hear me?" Her lips were blue. Her eyes opened just barely. She looked at him like she was not sure if he was real, the baby. She rasped. He tore the blanket open. The child was alive. Cold, too cold, but alive. He tucked the newborn under his coat, against his chest, and then turned back to the woman. "I am going to get you out of here," he said. She did not answer. Yates wrapped her up in his coat and lifted her into his arms. She did not weigh much, hardly anything at all. The baby squirmed weakly, but that sound, the whimper, was enough to keep him moving. He rode back with both of them wrapped close, praying the girl would not slip away like no. He could not think of that now. By the time he got back to his cabin, the sun had dropped behind the mountains. The wind howled through the pine. He kicked the door open with his boot, carried them both inside, and laid them near the fire. The woman was barely conscious. Her eyes fluttered open when he set her down, and she looked around like she did not know where she was. "You are safe," he said. "I am Yates Langford. This is my place." She blinked. Her lips moved, but no sound came. He got blankets, stoked the fire higher, and set water to boil. He did not ask her name. Not yet. He just did what needed to be done, dried her skin, wrapped her tight, checked the baby, a girl. He fed the little one a bit of sugar water with a cloth, rubbing her hands until they pinked up. That was when the woman finally spoke. "Is she?" Her voice cracked. "Is she all right?" "She is breathing." "You did good." She nodded, and then the tears came fast down her cheeks. She buried her face in her hands and wept like something inside her snapped. Yates looked away. He knew what it was to break like that. Last winter, it had been him kneeling in the snow with a child in his arms. His daughter, Rosa, fevered and wheezing, she had died before the sun came up. He had buried her behind the cabin when the ground was still frozen. He had not spoken her name out loud in months. Now, here was this woman, shaking from cold and grief and God knows what else, and a baby still breathing against the odds. "I will keep the fire going," he said quietly. "Water is warming. You need anything, you tell me." She nodded, but did not look up. He gave her space, but stayed nearby. The baby clung to his finger with the smallest hand he had ever seen. She finally spoke again after a long while. Her voice was raw. "My name is Vela O'Connell." He nodded. "Pleased to meet you, Vela." She looked up at that. Her eyes were brown gold, shadowed with exhaustion. "I did not think we would make it." "You did," he said. "You held on." She looked at the baby. "Her name is Ree." He nodded again. "That is a good name." They sat in silence for a while after that. The fire cracked. Vela drifted in and out, and Yates stayed close, feeding the fire, checking the baby, making hot broth when she could finally hold a cup. The next morning came gray and quiet. Snow still fell, but softer now, as if the worst of the storm had passed. Vela stood in front of the fire, her hands wrapped around the mug he gave her. She had changed into a dry shirt of his, sleeves rolled up, and a wool skirt he had kept from his sister's last visit. She was still pale but stronger. "You saved us," she said. "You kept her warm," he said. "I just got you out of the snow." She looked at him, really looked this time. "Why were you out there?" He hesitated. "I do not know. I just felt I should be." She nodded slow, like she understood anyway. You live out here alone? Yeah, she did not ask why. She just nodded again. I had nowhere else to go. Who left you out there? Her eyes turned hard. The man who said he would marry me. When he saw Ree, he changed his mind. Yates clenched his jaw. He could not speak for a moment. You do not have to worry about him now. I do not want to be a burden. You are not. She looked at him again, and her lips trembled. I do not know what to do now. He stepped closer. You heal, you rest. That is what you do. She gave him a look that held more than words could say, and then she whispered, Thank you. He did not smile, just gave a quiet nod and reached out to brush her hair back from her face. She leaned into his hand without thinking. Neither of them said anything for a long time. Outside, the storm passed on, but in that little cabin, something else had started taking root, slow and quiet, but strong, hope. The days stayed cold, but the sky turned clearer, and the wind softened around the edges. Yates kept to his daily rhythms, splitting wood, feeding the stock, checking the traps he'd set along the eastern creek. But each time he stepped through the cabin door, something had shifted. There was the scent of steeped mint where before there had only been smoke and pine. A child's breathy grunts rose from the cradle he'd built in the corner, and Vela's careful stitching now adorned the edge of a flower sack curtain she'd taken it upon herself to hem. She moved slowly still, her strength returning in pieces, but her hands stayed busy. He watched her once from the edge of the barn, unnoticed, as she stood outside with Ree wrapped to her chest, rocking gently back and forth while watching a crow hop across the frozen yard. The baby made a soft sound, and Vela hummed back to her, low and steady. Not a lullaby, something older, wordless. It did something to him, that sound. That evening, when the light was nearly gone, she stood near the stove, brow furrowed at a dented tin of cornmeal. I don't suppose you have vinegar, do you? She asked. He leaned against the doorframe. Use the last of it come fall. Why? I was thinking to make spoon bread, but without vinegar it won't lift right. His face stayed unreadable, but something in his voice warmed. I've never had it. Well then. She looked up at him, her mouth tugging into the first true smile she'd offered. You ought to. She made it with soured milk instead, and when he tasted it, he set down his fork and said, You ran from a man who didn't want this. I didn't run, she said simply. He left. Still, he gestured toward the plate. Foolish man. She didn't answer, but her eyes held a glint that hadn't been there before. Later, as the fire burned low and Ree slept against his chest while Vela washed the dishes, he cleared his throat. You got people out east? No, she said, rinsing a metal cup. My father died in '76. My mother before that. I was working in a millinery in Council Bluffs before, she paused. Before I took up with Emil, he was passing through with his uncle's freight wagon. I thought he'd marry me. When I told him I was expecting, he said he'd send for me after the next run. I waited 2 months. He never came back. Yates nodded once, slow. You walked from Council Bluffs. No. I followed a wagon train for a time. Then a family in Helena let me ride in the back of their cart, but they took off when I stopped to feed Ree. Left me with nothing but a blanket and a shawl. He said nothing for a while, just held the baby closer and watched the fire. I buried my daughter last February, he said quietly. She was 2 years old. Fever took her in under a day. My wife died birthing her. Vela turned from the wash basin, drying her hands with a rag. What was her name? Rosa. She walked over and sat across from him on the floor. Tell me about her. She liked to pretend the chickens were soldiers. Every morning, she'd march out there with a stick and give orders. Couldn't say sergeant proper called them sardines. His mouth twitched. I used to think the sound of her voice was the most alive thing I'd ever heard. Vela reached forward and touched Rosa's name where he'd carved it into the wood along the base of the hearth. Her fingers lingered there. I'll never ask you to forget her, she said. But if you ever want to talk about her, I'll listen. He looked at her for a long while, the fire catching in the gold of her eyes. I think she'd have liked you, he said. The next morning, Vela rose early and swept the floor before he could stop her. I need to start pulling my weight, she said. You've taken care of us long enough. I didn't ask for anything back, he said. I know. That's why I want to. When she stepped outside with a pail, he followed her to the pump. She shivered when the wind hit her, and he shrugged off his coat and laid it over her shoulders without a word. She looked down at the sleeves hanging past her hands, then up at him. You're a quiet man, Yates Langford. He tipped his head. Don't see the use in talking what don't need saying. She met his eyes. Then I'll make sure what I say's worth hearing. He smiled, just a little. That you already do. She stood there a moment longer, the pump handle in her hand, the coat wrapped around her slight frame. Then she looked at the heavy clouds rolling in from the west and asked, That creek you mentioned, the one near the ridge, are there fish come spring? Trout. Good ones. Think Ree and I could come along when it thaws. He didn't answer right away. Just reached into the pail she'd filled and let a handful of water run through his fingers. You both stay as long as you want, he said. Spring or after? She didn't nod, didn't thank him, just stood there beside him, quiet as the snow beginning to fall again, not afraid, not uncertain. And for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the weight of silence. It felt like something else instead. Like promise. The sun found its way through the high clouds by late February, the light slanting pale and sharp across the drifts that still clung to the north side of the cabin. By then, Vela could manage the stove without tiring, and Ree's cheeks had taken on the ruddy hue of a child who'd known warmth more days than cold. Yates had repaired the lean-to roof with pine planks while the weather held, and when he came in with sawdust in his beard and a new nick along his knuckle, Vela met him at the door with a clean rag and a look that gave him pause. Let me see it, she said firmly, already reaching for his hand. He offered it without a word, watching the way her thumb pressed gently along the edge of the cut, eyes narrowed as she worked. You'll want to wrap it tight. You keep working like that and it'll split open again. I've done worse, he said. That doesn't mean you should keep doing worse. He studied her as she tied the cloth. Her hands were steady, her brow drawn in focus. She didn't meet his gaze until she'd finished, and when she did, something quiet passed between them. You could have left us where you found us, she said. You didn't. I couldn't, he replied. That night, after Ree had gone down easy, the cabin felt close but not crowded. Vela sat by the hearth, mending the hem of an old cot blanket. Yates leaned back in the ladder-back chair near the window, one boot braced against the floor, eyes on the fire but not seeing it. You ever think of leaving this place? She asked, voice low. He didn't answer right away. Then I did, after Rosa. Thought about heading south, maybe into Wyoming territory, but I kept waking up thinking she'd be looking for me here, even if she's not. I can't leave her behind. Vela nodded slowly, her hands still. I used to dream of New Orleans, the way the women dressed in the fashion papers. The music, the scent of magnolia, but I never made it farther than Kansas City. You want to go there still? She looked over at him, needle paused mid-stitch. No, not anymore. He shifted forward, elbows on his knees. Why not? Because the kind of life I want now. It's smaller, quieter. I used to think I had to chase something to be someone, but I was wrong. He didn't speak, just let her words settle in the room like snowflakes against glass. She set the blanket aside and stood. Would you show me how to fire your rifle, in case I need to? He rose with a nod. We'll go out tomorrow. I've got a bolt action you can manage. They stepped outside early the next morning, the sky clear and sharp-edged, boots crunching through the crusted snow. Yates handed her the rifle, adjusted her grip, and stepped back. Don't fight the recoil. Let it move through you. Vela took a breath and fired. The shot rang out, echoing off the low hills. She blinked, steadied herself. Again, she said. By the time they returned to the cabin, she had hit the target twice. Not perfect, but enough. Thank you, she said, handing the rifle back. Yates gave a quiet nod, then reached up to brush a fragment of bark from her hair. His fingers lingered longer than they needed to, and her eyes met his with something unspoken but certain. Inside, Ree stirred from her nap, and Vela went to her, lifting her gently. The baby nuzzled into her shoulder, half asleep still. Yates watched them, then said, "I've been thinking." She turned toward him, waiting. "I've got enough land to spare. Room for a garden come spring. If you wanted to. Stay on, I'd be glad for the company." Her expression didn't falter. "You're not asking out of pity, are you?" "No," he said. "I'm asking because the place feels right with you here, because I want you here." She stepped closer, Ree still tucked against her shoulder, and looked up at him. "Then I'll stay," he exhaled, something in his chest loosening. "I'll build you a proper bed," he said. "Not just a cot in the corner." She smiled, soft and sure. "Build it big enough for 3. He reached out then, not rushed, not uncertain, just steady. His hand cradled the side of her face, and she leaned into it, eyes closing for a breath. When she opened them again, he was still there, and nothing between them felt unfinished. The wind had died by dusk. Smoke rose clean from the chimney, and from the ridgeline, the cabin looked like it belonged to the land as much as the trees or the snow. Inside, the fire burned low, and the future waited, quiet and bright. By early March, the hard frost began to lift from the soil near the tree line, and the creek behind the cabin ran louder each morning, swollen with meltwater. Yates had begun clearing the patch beside the barn for planting, the ground still stubborn beneath his spade, but no longer frozen clean through. Vela stood nearby with Ree in a linen sling tied across her front, brushing away last season's brittle stems with a willow broom she'd found in the loft. When the wind shifted to the south, carrying the faint, wet scent of thawing earth, Vela paused and looked toward the horizon. "You ever keep bees?" she asked. Yates straightened from where he was digging. "No, never had the time for it. I helped a widow keep hives back in Iowa." She said the honey was her second husband. Her voice was dry, but her lips curved faintly, kept her warm and sweet through the lean years. He rested his weight against the shovel handle. "You thinkin' of starting some, if we can find the timber for boxes?" I still remember how to split the wax from the comb. She adjusted the sling where Ree slept, then added, "You've got enough wildflower come summer. Could be something." Yates nodded slowly. "I'll keep an eye out for scrap boards next ride into town." She studied him a moment before asking, "Do you go in often?" "Twice a season, more or less." She tilted her head. "Would you mind if I came when you go? Ree's old enough now for the ride, and there's things I'd like to trade if you'd let me." Yates wiped his brow with his sleeve. "You don't need my say-so." "I know." Her gaze held his. "But I want it." He nodded once. "All right then. We'll go when the road dries." Later that week, she brought down a bundle of lace remnants and fine thread from the trunk she hadn't opened since arriving. She laid the materials out on the table and began stitching them into handkerchiefs and christening caps, quiet and focused in the amber light of the cabin. Yates watched her work between his chores, never interrupting, but filing away the way her shoulders relaxed once she had the needle in her hand. One evening, he came in late from hauling stone and found her sitting at the table with a finished cap in her lap, the edges scalloped with a delicate stitch. Ree dozed in the cradle, one fist curled beneath her chin. "What's that one for?" he asked, nodding toward the cap. "Trade," she said, smoothing the cloth. "There's a seamstress in town, Miss Havorson. Heard she's always looking for fine work." He set down his gloves and stepped closer. "You planning to work for her, if she'll have me?" She met his eyes. "I don't want to live here just because I owe you." "You don't." "I know," she said, gentler now. "But I want to build something of my own, too. I want Ree to grow up watching me do more than survive." Yates pulled out the chair beside her and sat, fingers laced in front of him. "You could do both." She looked down at the cap. "What if I fail?" "Then you'll try something else," he said. "You've already done harder things." Her hand reached across the table, slow and sure. She laid her fingers over his. "You always say the right thing when I need to hear it." "I only ever say what I mean." She didn't let go of his hand. "I'm glad it was you who found us." He turned his palm beneath hers, closing his fingers softly around hers. Me too. The next morning, while Yates loaded the wagon with bags of oats and a coil of rope for trade, Vela packed a basket with her handwork, a jar of dried apple slices and clean cloths for Ree. She wore a navy skirt she hadn't touched since that first day at the hearth, pressed smooth now and belted close to her waist. She wrapped Ree snug in a wool shawl, then climbed up beside Yates on the bench. The road to town was still rutted in places, the wagon jostling over the soft ground, but the air was mild, and the sky stretched wide and blue above the pines. Ree slept most of the way, and Vela kept one hand at the base of the sling, the other resting on her thigh. As they reached the outer edge of the settlement, children ran along the muddy lane, and a man hammered shingles onto a new saloon roof. Vela watched it all with quiet eyes. "Feels smaller than I remembered," she said. "Things shrink when you've lived through too much," he replied. She turned toward him. "You talk like someone who's come through the fire." "Maybe I have," he said, "but I'm still standing." They stopped outside the trading post, and Yates helped her down, steadying her with both hands. Her eyes searched his face for a moment before she took a breath and walked toward the mercantile. Inside, she moved through the shop with purpose, goods under one arm, Ree nestled against her chest. She spoke with the seamstress, exchanged samples, and shook hands. When she returned to Yates, the light in her face had changed. "She'll take my work," she said there's a market for baby things. He tipped his hat back. "I believe it." They rode home in quiet, the wind rising only once, enough to lift the edge of her shawl. When they reached the cabin, she stepped down and turned to him. "You didn't ask me what I wanted from her. I reckoned you'd tell me if you wanted to. I asked for coin, not credit. I want to build something real." "You already are," he said. She looked up at him and then, without hesitation, kissed his cheek. "Thank you for letting me." He didn't answer, just reached for the basket in her hands and carried it inside. That night, as they sat near the hearth, Vela working a new stitch and Yates whittling a small wooden spoon, Ree stirred in her cradle and let out a soft sigh. Neither of them moved to hush her. The quiet in the room was the kind that held rather than weighed. And for the first time, there was no question in the space between them, only the certainty of ground newly thawed, ready for planting. By mid-April, the land had softened enough to take the first planting. Vela knelt in the tilled rows behind the cabin, her skirts pinned up above her boots, fingers pressing bean seed into the damp soil. Ree sat nearby atop a folded wool blanket, a circle of smooth stones surrounding her like a small fortress. Each time the wind kicked up, she reached for the nearest one, examining it with the gravity only infants could manage. Yates crouched a short distance away, setting a string line for the second row. He didn't speak much while they worked, but his presence steadied her like the weight of a warm coat across the shoulders before dawn broke. She'd come to count on it without realizing it, the quiet way he moved through the world and made room for her in it. "You always plant this early?" she asked, wiping dirt from her knuckles. "If I wait too long, the deer eat everything before it takes root." She glanced toward the tree line. "Back east, my father used to hang strips of cloth soaked in lye water to keep them off." Said the smell reminded them of fire. Yates paused in tying the line. "We could try that. I've got some old shirts too worn for rags." She pushed herself upright with a soft grunt, brushing her palms on her apron. "I'll boil them down tonight." Instead of turning back to his task, he watched her a moment. "You think you'll miss town work?" She looked over at Ree, now gnawing on a twig with great focus. "No, I think I've had enough of other people's expectations." He nodded, but said nothing else. She stepped closer, brushing a bit of bark from his shoulder. "I like what we've made here," she said. "It feels like it belongs." When he looked at her, his expression wasn't unreadable anymore. It was full of quiet certainty and something else she hadn't dared name until now. That evening, after supper, Yates pulled a small wooden box from the shelf above the hearth. He set it down in front of her and opened the lid. Inside lay a carved brooch, simple and smooth, shaped like a cottonwood leaf with a narrow silver pin affixed at the back. "I made it for Rosa," he said, voice low. "She was too young to wear it. I kept thinking I'd give it to her when she was grown." Vela reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of the leaf. "It's beautiful." "I want you to have it," he said, "not instead of her, but because of her. Because you reminded me that life can still grow here." Her eyes stung before she could stop them. She lifted the brooch gently and pinned it to the collar of her blouse. "I'll wear it every day," she whispered. He stepped closer. "I don't know what comes next. But I do know I want to build it with you, if you'll have me." She reached up and laid her palm against his chest, over the steady beat of his heart. "You already have me, Yates." He leaned in, slow and certain, and kissed her. The room stood still around them, the fire low, the baby asleep in her cradle, the scent of soil still clinging to their clothes. It wasn't a kiss of promise. It was one of arrival. 2 days later, they stood beneath the cottonwoods behind the cabin with Ree in Vela's arms, and a preacher from the next valley standing in front of them with a worn book in hand. There were no guests, no ribbons, no cake, just the sky, the trees, and the sound of the creek running strong behind them. The preacher's words were plain and brief, but they felt like stone dropped into deep water, each one rippling outward, making room for everything to come. After the vows, Yates kissed her again, and this time, Ree gave a delighted squeal that made both of them laugh. They spent the rest of the day as they always did, bringing in wood, feeding the chickens, checking the sprouting rows. But everything had shifted. The silence between them now held a steady warmth. The space beside the fire was shared. Her sewing basket sat next to his rifle rack. His coat hung beside her shawl. That night, after Ree had gone down, Vela turned in their bed and looked at him in the dark. Her voice was hushed but steady. "I never thought I'd have this. Not again, not after everything." He reached for her hand beneath the blanket. "You have it now, and you always will." She closed her eyes and let herself rest fully for the first time in years. He kept watch a while longer, listening to her breathing, the hush of spring wind against the roof. Years passed. The cottonwoods grew thicker along the creek, and the garden bore enough to trade by the third summer. Vela's honey sold well, and she filled orders through the post in town. Ree learned to walk along the furrows and later to read by lamplight, her mother's voice always close and clear. Yates taught her how to track deer, how to shape wood, and how to listen before she spoke. They built a second room onto the cabin when Ree turned 6. Vela painted the walls with milkwash, and dried herbs from the garden hung along the rafters. On cold nights, they all still gathered near the hearth, Ree curled up with a book on the floor, Yates fixing harness leather, and Vela humming as she stitched a new hem, the brooch at her collar catching the firelight. They never left Montana. They didn't need to. They had built a life from what was left behind, and filled it with the kind of love that asked nothing but truth and gave everything in return. And in that quiet, steady place, they lived every day with the kind of peace that comes only when the long storm has passed, and the sun, at last, rises warm and clear.